And where we are, you'll remember from last week, we started talking about Unit 6. We got most of the way through Unit 6. We just have a few more things to talk about. And just as a quick recap, some things that we talked about in Unit 6 were some public land use controls. Remember
Hello? Sorry, I can't hear you. I don't know if it's me.
Then you need to log out.
It might be me.
Let me send you a chat. Log out, restart, and log back in. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So we talked about some public land use control with zoning. We talked about some public land use controls with building codes and permits and on-site septic systems and various regulations with like wetlands, and everything that we talked about last week in Unit 6 so far was about public land use controls. So the last little piece that we have left in Unit 6 is to talk about private land use controls. Who wants to remind me, either on mute or in a chat, who wants to remind me, who enforces public land use controls? If there's a violation of public land use controls, who enforces that? Somebody says the courts. The county, sheriff, the courts. Yeah, it's enforced by our local law enforcement, our local state government. Okay, so who enforces it? The courts, the police, law enforcement. Now we need to talk about private land use controls. Private land use controls are what we are referring to when we talk about HOAs, and particularly the covenants that HOAs impose. This is one of these things that we can call it several different things, but it all means the same thing. Restrictive covenants, protective covenants, CCRs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Private land use controls are enforced by the HOA. So remember we said last week, if you see your neighbor violating zoning, maybe they converted their garage into a hair salon, and now on your nice quiet street, you got 20 cars, extra cars going up and down the street a day because they're going to get their hair cut. And you don't like this. You know that they're violating zoning. This only is zoned for residential. You contact the cops or law enforcement. If your neighbor is violating a covenant, if your neighbor is not following the rules of the HOA, you contact the HOA. Do not call the cops. The cops aren't going to be able to help you because it's a private land use control. Private land use controls are, or covenants specifically, are generally recorded down at the courthouse, down at the public records. So we always should have access to them. Part of the big reasons that you may or may not choose, or your buyer may or may not choose to live in a neighborhood with an HOA, to live in a neighborhood with covenants, with restrictions. The developer, remember, imposes these covenants when they're creating the subdivision. And the whole point is to help preserve value of the neighborhood. Some of you may not like the idea of living next door to somebody that has 5 cars in their front yard on cinder blocks. If you don't like that, if you get an HOA, I can almost promise it won't be allowed. What is or is not allowed in the neighborhood varies from HOA to HOA. I need you guys to understand that all HOAs are different. They're not all created equal. Some are more stricter than others. So you might have some that says no parking cars on cinder blocks in the front yard. You may have some that say you can't park the RV in the driveway. You may have some that say the grass in your front yard can't get any taller than X amount. Some may tell you here the 3 shades you can paint your front door. You guys with me? Some are more restrictive than others. How restrictive depends on the HOA. What about covenants that don't have an HOA? They still have somebody enforcing the covenants. And that's what we're talking about here is this private land use control. I'm willing to bet when we first saw this slide, I could take this class and I could put us into 2 groups of people. Those of you that went, ew, look at that house. And the rest of us went, ew, look at that house. Some of you may not like the idea of living next door to Pepto-Bismol pink. Some of you may not want to see this every time you open your blinds in the morning. If that's you, you may want to consider getting an HOA that doesn't allow extravagant colors like bubblegum pink, exterior colors like bubblegum pink. HOAs, again, some people like them, some people don't. If you're helping a buyer buy and they say, absolutely, I don't want to be in an HOA, I don't want to deal with covenants, I don't want to deal with those rules, then don't show them property in those HOAs. You guys with me? Sometimes having conversations up front with your buyers and learning what they want before everybody jumps in their car and goes look at property, we can save both of ourselves some time and money. I mean, remember like last year, gas wasn't cheap, was it? So before you drive all over town showing property, don't you want to make sure that your buyer kind of knows what they want to buy? We're going to talk more about asking buyer questions and working with buyers as we get more into agency. So with our private land use controls, particularly with our covenants, again, the provisions are generally revolved around property maintenance. Like I said, your mailbox can only be a certain color. That's a good one I've always heard. The grass in your front yard can't be any taller than X amount. And occasionally you'll have a neighbor that's like really bored and needs a hobby, and they'll be out there with their yardstick measuring the grass in your front yard and make sure you're in compliance. So they know if they need to call the HOA on you or not. The covenants may offer restrictions on parking. Can you park on the street? Can you park the RV in the driveway? Are you allowed to have a fence? Are you allowed to have a shed? And then certain architectural details. You guys remember from previous units, we said the only thing you know by looking at a fence is that somebody put a fence there. So let's say you're showing property in an HOA that has covenants, and you're in the backyard with the buyer with a potential home, and your buyer looks at the neighbor's yard and they say, oh, good. I was going to ask you if we could put a fence up in this HOA, but I see the neighbor has one, so I know I'm good. What are you going to say? You don't know nothing by looking at that fence. The only way to know that a fence is allowed in the HOA is to help your buyers get their hands on those covenants so we can see for themselves. Guys, that neighbor in the HOA could be in the throes of the legal battle, for example, to have that fence removed. That neighbor could be being fined X amount per day that they have that fence up. You guys with me? So never tell your buyer, sure, you can have a fence, a shed, anything you want, without helping them get their hands on those covenants so they can verify that. Again, they're down at the public records. A lot of sellers will provide them. Maybe the HOA will provide them if you call up, but there's several different resources we have to get our hands on those. So never assume. Always help your buyer verify. Covenants are imposed by the developer when they create that subdivision. So the developer, we talked last week about the creation of subdivisions, whether or not we're going to have covenants, whether or not we're going to have an HOA is up to the developer. It's however they want to create it, and they create the rules, the covenants. So the developer creates these covenants, they build the subdivision, and then they leave. But guess what? The covenants stay. All owners have to follow covenants, not just the first buyer of the first unit, but the second buyer of the resale, the fifth buyer, so on and so on. Covenants are pertinent. What does a pertinent mean? They run with the land. So they are going to follow buyer to buyer to buyer. So they're there long after the developer stays, or long after the developer is gone, excuse me, the covenants will stay. Developers will also spell out who is going to manage them. Are they going to have an owners association? Somebody asked about an HOA, or who do you call? Sometimes you have areas, maybe they don't have it, an HOA is like a set monthly due that you owe each month, but they have property owners, so they all take turns with roles. So you all take turns doing like president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, all making sure that the covenants are enforced. The one thing that the developer cannot create covenants for is something that is illegal. And it might be that when the covenants were created, it wasn't illegal at that time, but now it's illegal. So now that covenant is unenforceable. You cannot force somebody to break the rule. As an example of that, there were some covenants that were created in like the 40s, 50s, probably even into the 60s. And those covenants back in those days might have said that a certain member of a protected class can't buy in this neighborhood. They might have specifically said a certain member of a protected class cannot buy or live in this neighborhood. Well, guess what? Fast forward to 2023, we have fair housing laws that says anybody is free to live wherever they want to. So today, that covenant is not legal, thus it can't be enforced. I got a whole unit dedicated to fair housing. We're going to talk about those protected classes. We're going to talk about who they are and what our role is as agents. So that's like near the end of class. Near the end of class in Unit 19, fair housing. So private land use controls are enforced and regulated by whomever's running them, owner association, property owners, etc. They're all different, all different. Our biggest duty is to help our buyers get their hands on them. So let's do a quick side-by-side comparison of zoning and covenants. Man, we got rules coming from all over the place, don't we? Didn't I stand here on day one and tell you if you own fee simple absolute, you do whatever you want to with your property, except you can't break the law. Well, there's lots of laws out there telling you what you can do, zoning, covenants, etc. General rule of thumb, anytime you have two conflicting laws, in this case, zoning versus covenants, general rule of thumb says the more restrictive of the two will prevail. Anytime you have conflicting laws, the more restrictive of the two will prevail. So let's say, for example, zoning, the area is zoned for residential and commercial. The subdivisions covenants say residential only. Which one is more strict? I think the HOA is more strict. So which one's going to prevail? The HOA. So can you do zoning in that or commercial in that subdivision? No, because the stricter of the two will prevail. So to tie this unit up, we're going to talk about the broker, kind of our responsibilities. Remember, this is our first unit that brings us involved. I hope If you guys look, for example, on pages 126 and 127, do you see where that says responsibility of real estate brokers? I hope when you see something like that, I hope you read it. It's important, not just for your test, but for your career. Please don't read it now, but make yourself a note. Responsibility of the broker is pointing you to something important. So when it comes to these zonings, covenants, public land use controls, private land use controls, we have a duty to verify before we list the property. For example, listing agents, you're going to have to look up the zoning before you can list the property for sale. Buyer's agents, when you're writing an offer, for the most part, we should be able to rely what's advertised. We should be able to rely what's in the multiple listing services. Unless your little red flag goes up and causes you to ask a lot of questions, or unless your buyer has a specific need. If your buyer as a buyer's agent have a specific need, then we need to make sure that their end use will be allowed. Remember the buyer that wants to convert a garage into a hair salon? I need to make sure zoning will allow it. And I need to make sure if they're in an HOA, if they're in covenants or subdivision, I need to make sure that the subdivision will allow it as well. I am not an attorney. I'm just a real estate agent, which means I cannot interpret legal documents. Land use controls, covenants, those are legal documents. My job is to help my buyer find them. Help put those covenants in their hands so they can make sure they're good with them before they buy, before they purchase the home. We're going to help our buyer get that information. And if your buyer looks at you and says, what does this mean? Don't try to be the hero. Either tell them to talk to their attorney or get them to the HOA. Welcome. So we do not interpret these land use controls. That's the job of the attorney. We're learning to stay in our lane. As the broker, we need to advise all consumers if any zoning ordinances or covenants could affect how they use the property, their enjoyment of the property. Again, you guys, simple philosophy. If it's important to my buyer, then it's important to me. And if my buyer says, this is my end use, this is what I want, this is what I'm looking for, then I have a duty to make sure that their end use is allowed. Talking more about the broker. If your buyer is interested in buying in a place subject to an owner's association, if there's dues, if there's going to be special assessments, we need to let our buyers know. Again, we're helping them gather the information. We're helping them gather this information so they can make an informed decision. And something like paying monthly dues, for example, or biannual assessments is absolutely something we want to make sure that they know. Still talking about the broker. Advise our consumers to carefully review the documents. Don't just say, yeah, sounds good. Make sure they review them. Make sure they're looking for what they can and can't do. Again, if they think they're going to park the RV and the boat in the driveway, they need to know if the HOA is going to allow that or not. If the subdivision with the covenants is going to allow that. Now, this gets interesting because this says trying to review these documents before we sign an offer. And while that sounds good in a perfect world, we don't really live in a perfect world, do we? Sometimes, like for example, last year, Guys, I'm not kidding. Homes were on the market. Homes were available for like a couple hours. If you've been following the market last year, when we say they were flying off the shelf, it was hard to get covenants in their hands before they signed. But guess what? Shortly after they signed, we were helping them get these documents. We were helping them gather the information. Buyers kind of have a grace period that they can learn and inspect and investigate the property. We're going to talk about their grace period and when and how they can terminate. We'll get to that when we get to Unit 10. But the recommendation is to help your buyers get these documents in their hand before they sign an offer. Remember what we've been saying. A buyer deserves to know what they're buying. And this does include if they're buying in an HOA or subdivision with covenants. And the last thing I want us to take from this unit as far as the broker's role, we've kind of talked about, but now we're really going to introduce you the idea of looking out for red flag items. Red flag items are items that should prompt you to ask questions, prompt you to investigate, prompt you to help your buyer or seller find the answers. We talked briefly, for example, last week about properties being in a flood hazard. And I don't know for sure if it's in a flood hazard until I look at the FEMA map, until I look at the flood map. But what I do know is if I'm showing a property and there's a creek or a stream out back, my little red flag should go up to cause me to investigate. Could it be in a flood zone? I don't know, but my little red flag went up. So recognizing signs that could cause flooding in that example. Recognizing if the property is in a subdivision. Anytime we have a little red flag go up, we've got to investigate it. Don't ignore it and think that it's going to go away on its own. We're starting to introduce you the idea of these little red flags. We're going to have our little red flag going up quite a bit when we get to agency. The last little piece of Unit 6 is just talking about government-owned land, property that the government owns that's not available to us. It's estimated, and it's just an estimate, that the government owns approximately 30% of the continental United States. So 30% is dedicated for government use for, as you can see here, schools, military stations. A lot of our parks are heavily regulated, national and state regulations. Trying to preserve those resources, protect the critters that live there. And that gets us through Unit 6. I told you we were close. We were close. So those key terms, back on page 109. Your key point review. Your summary, your checklist for this unit is on page 128. And then your student quiz for Unit 6 is on page 130. Questions on private land use controls.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's say that you have a buyer who's going to be living out in the county. There's no HOA or anything like that, but they have like project cars. It's not like a business, but like they're going to have the cars on blocks and the parts in their yard. Is there covenants and stuff out in the county that prevent them from doing that type of thing?
They could be, but if they're not in a subdivision that's regulated by those covenants, then they're gonna have to worry about it.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
could they be out? Could you have subdivisions and covenants out in the county? Sure. You're probably more apt to not. I tell you, probably one of the y'all want to know, my coworker and I were just talking about this the other day, given the current market, economic market. And y'all want to know probably one of the number one questions we feel we get asked from buyers, or one of the things we're told from buyers. They want to live somewhere where they can have chickens. Everybody wants chickens, especially now. I haven't been egg shopping lately, but what I'm seeing on my social media, the price of eggs. Do I need to get a chicken? You know, so everybody wants chickens. Are chickens allowed? Well, we need to check with the city. Are they allowed in the city limits? Do we need to get you out in the county? Are you in a subdivision? If so, does a subdivision, the covenants allow chickens, right? That's not a simple yes or no question. When your buyer looks at you and says, can we get a chicken? Can we have a chicken? The answer is, let's look into it and find out. Please don't blurt something out just for the sake of blurting something out.
I have a question. So we're talking about who's more restrictive. With the solar panels being so popular now, and everybody wanting, the government wanting you to have them. So what about if your HOA says absolutely not? Because the county says yes, because they want you to have them, and then the HOA says no.
Which is more restrictive?
I guess the HOA.
So there you go. Could all the homeowners get together and try to petition to change that rule? I mean, sure, it gets more involved legally than we're getting into this class. But the more restrictive of the two will prevail. So if the HOA won't change their rules, then no, we can't have solar panels. Now, again, we can always discuss, maybe take it to a judge, right? And try to make that happen. But you just can't, because the county says it's okay and covenants say no. The more restrictive of the two is going to prevail.
Okay.
Good question comes in. Are private and public land use controls appurtenant? Private land use controls are appurtenant. Public, I'm going to say no, because they change. Remember, we talked about zoning ordinances changes, and you can have a zoning amendment. So zoning is very flexible. Good questions. Okay. You want to take a big deep breath with me?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one question.
Okay. Exhale, guys. Don't hold that breath. We'll do it.
So
Yeah.
if somebody stops paying the HOA and like they already paid off their home, are they, can the HOA take that home away, or what happens then?
Anybody that you owe money to, they can foreclose on you. So could the HOA foreclose on you because you're not paying them? Sure. Could they take you to court so you pay them? Sure. Could they fine you? Could they collect interest every day that you're not paying? Sure, sure, sure. What are they going to do? It should be spelled out in the covenants.
Okay.
They're all different. Yep. Your mortgage is only with your lender. It has absolutely nothing to do with the HOA. The HOA cares about paying me. Okay, now we can breathe, right? Big deep breath. There we go. So we're moving right along. We're going to skip around just a bit. Remember, I don't go in order of the book. I go in order of the syllabus. So up next in the syllabus is Unit 20. Unit 20 starts on page 497. Anybody get a chance to look ahead at Unit 20? Few of you? This is the unit that makes you terrified to breathe the air that you breathe, isn't it? There's a lot of super scary stuff in this unit. So let's talk about it. In this unit, the big highlight of this unit is talking about various environmental hazards. And what we need to do, it's all about protecting the client. It's all about helping to educate the client when we encounter these environmental issues. Now, before we get into this unit, I want you guys to look with me on page 499. And there's a picture there that gives us all the environmental concerns that we're getting ready to talk about. I doubt you're going to have one home with everything. This is like the scariest house I've ever seen in my entire life. If I were your agent, I would highly recommend you not buy this house. So please don't think we're going to, I mean, I'm not saying you can't, obviously you can't, But this isn't meant to say, this is only a concern if you got everything. This is just letting us know where some of these, or where these environmental concerns can affect some properties. So Unit 20 is all about our environmental issues. Environmental issues are important to us because they're health issues. In real estate, we deal with people. People have concerns about their health. So it all ties into us. And as we're going to learn, kind of the common theme throughout this unit is that I have a duty to disclose any environmental issues or concerns once I learn about them. If I don't learn about them, I can't disclose them, can I? But once I learn about them, we have a duty to disclose to the consumers and point the consumers in the right direction so they can get further information to figure out what they need to do to protect themselves and their family. Most environmental issues, the best place to start is the EPA's website, Environmental Protection Agency. And for a lot of these issues that we're discussing, the EPA's website is generally a good place to start. So the last couple weeks together, we've kind of danced around this idea of a material fact. We're going to get into material facts and break it down for you when we get into Unit 7, probably tomorrow night. But right now, let's just, because we're going to talk a lot about material facts in this unit. So right now, let's just have an understanding for the time being that a material fact is just any fact that a reasonable person would consider relevant when they're trying to make a decision. Again, we're going to have a full-blown conversation about material facts. We're going to break it down when we get into Unit 7. But a lot of these environmental issues are material facts. And once we learn about a material fact, we have to disclose it. That absolutely applies to these environmental issues. So y'all ready to talk about some scary stuff? First scary thing to talk about is asbestos. Asbestos was once used as insulation. We typically see it when we wrap it around pipes. Maybe it helps keep the pipes warm. Sometimes it can be used various places to help with sound absorption, maybe. Asbestos was banned from building materials in 1978. Now, you don't need to know that year as it relates to asbestos. We're going to see this year again in just a second. But asbestos was banned in 1978, which means if you're showing a property or helping a buyer buy or helping a seller sell with anything built after 1978, you shouldn't encounter asbestos. Here's the deal with asbestos. As long as it's intact, it's fine, it's not an issue. The problem with asbestos is when it becomes friable. You see our picture here, you see how this is hanging down, it's just kind of loosely hanging there. This should be wrapped around this pipe. This is friable asbestos. And the problem when it becomes friable is the little particles break down and they get in the air. We breathe the air and those little particles get into our lungs. It affects respiratory. Have you guys seen the commercials? And I'm going to try really hard not to botch this word up. But have you seen the commercials talking about if you or someone you know has mesothelioma, you know that word? Yeah, that word. That's the result of asbestos exposure. It's a hard word. That's the result of asbestos exposure. And that's what that attorney, those commercials and those attorneys are trying to capture, are those that have been exposed to asbestos. When we come across asbestos, we're going to have the professionals take care of it. You and I aren't out there taking care of it. But if we come across asbestos, removal is not the preferred method, because when you remove it, you disrupt it. And when you disrupt it, if it's not friable yet, it will be once you start removing it. It will be once you start disrupting it. If at all possible, the preferred method for asbestos is encapsulation, in which case they come up here and they kind of rewrap that, they seal it off and they rewrap it around the pipe. Again, if you're helping your buyer buy an older home and they have plans for major renovations or flat out demolition, and it was built prior to 1978, they very well could be dealing with asbestos. We just need to advise them to have it treated properly. Yep. Another environmental issue, environmental concern is lead. You may have heard of lead-based paint. We could also find lead in home from dust from lead pipes or solder. The connecting agent connects two pipes together. The deal with lead, the concern with lead tends to affect children, those young developing bodies, those little developing organs. Those are what's affected by lead. Pregnant women, their fetus could be affected by lead. Again, developing bodies, developing organs. One of the best things we can do when it comes to lead is help to educate the consumer. And as a matter of fact, the EPA has helped us out by giving us this little booklet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, that we can pass on to our buyers to help them understand what they're considering buying, to help them understand the dangers and the concerns. By the way, you guys, this also applies to tenants, because tenants live in residential units, and if they were built prior to a certain year that we're getting ready to see, and they have children, then we want to educate them as well. So residential property. So lead was banned from residential property building. It was banned in 1978. You need to know this year as it relates to lead. Anything built prior to 1978, lead was banned. And we have a form that we use about lead. And that form is called the lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard addendum. And this form is required on all sales and leases, anything built prior to 1978. We need to know that year. If an owner learns of lead in the home, they've got to disclose it for sale and for lease. So if an owner knows of lead in the home, they have to learn it. If the owner has had contracting work done, homes built prior to 1978, and the owners had contracting work done, the contractors should have had that paint sample sent off and tested for lead. If it's a do-it-yourselfer, that do-it-yourselfer may not know that they could have it tested. If you hire contracted work and your home was built prior to 1978, they should be testing that. And the owner has got to disclose. And here's the deal. This addendum is not saying your home was built in 1978, so you have lead. That's not what this says. This addendum says, because your home was built prior to 1978, it may have lead. Anything prior to 1978, we can always encourage our buyers to have it inspected. Again, talking about that inspection process and further units. Target housing, when it comes to lead, is just any housing that was built prior to 1978. Y'all got that year embedded in your head yet? What year is it? Anything built prior to 1978. I see your mouths move. Thank you. Target housing is any residential constructed prior to 1978. There's some exceptions to target housing. Not everything built prior to 1978 needs to be in danger of lead. A couple exemptions we have: housing that was built for elderly people is going to be exempt from this target housing. Remember what we just said, lead poisoning affects young developing bodies. So if you build housing for elderly people, that's not the concern. The other exception to target housing is 0-bedroom dwellings. A 0-bedroom dwelling is a studio apartment or a dorm room or military barracks. So they are exempt from the target housing. Tom, you are absolutely correct. And we are heading in that direction. Yep. We mentioned earlier that contractors, if you're having contracted work done on your home, they're required to send it off and have it tested for lead. They'll chip up some of the paint from the windowsill or the door frame, send it off to the lab and have it tested. If they don't do this, they're facing some hefty fines. Again, you guys, do-it-yourselfers. Anybody ever painted a room? You may not know that you were supposed to do that. That's what we mean by do-it-yourselfers. But the contracted work, and these fines, I mean, these are per day, right? So the state could pop you $750 per day that you're in violation. EPA could hit you for $32,500 per day if found in violation. I asked this on the first day, but let me ask you again. You don't have to fess up to me if you don't want to now, knowing my opinion, but where were my HGTV fans? Where you guys at? You know your friends, Chip and Joanna? They got themselves in trouble several years ago for misappropriating, mishandling something. I don't remember the details, but they got themselves in trouble for not handling lead-based paint properly. This isn't just a, HGTV is pretty reality, but the reality is there's enforcement, there's laws, there's regulations that everybody has to follow, including Chip and Joanna. They probably paid the fees and they're fine now. So when it comes to lead, what does lead mean for us? What does it see to us? Well, again, we need to disclose the presence of any known lead-based paint in the home. I can only disclose what I know. So if, as we said earlier, if the seller knows, they have to disclose. If the buyer has an inspection and they learn of lead in the home and they tell the agents, now the agents know, and we have to disclose. As we start talking more and more about these material facts, I want you guys to understand, I don't care how you find out. It doesn't matter to me how you learn about it. Once you know, you know. And another big responsibility that we have when it comes to lead-based paint is making sure that buyers and sellers are in compliance with the addendum. The seller has to disclose if they know. If they have any records or reports available, they are to provide them to the potential buyer. The buyer has to be given the opportunity to have that paint tested for lead should they choose during their inspection period. Talking about that inspection period more in Unit 10. Once we know, we have to disclose. Questions on lead?
So the only responsibility for the real estate agent is to disclose any information about lead.
What we know. Disclose what we know. Yep. And our other responsibility is make sure buyers and sellers are in compliance, are following the rules, are properly completing the addendum. Another scary thing we got out there in the environment is radon. Radon is the byproduct of decaying matters in the ground. So things get in the ground, they decay, those decaying matters release these gases. Gases get into the atmosphere, gases get up into the air. They're looking for release through like cracks in the ground. And if the gas happens to escape, if the gas happens to find a crack in the ground that's under your house, then you could potentially have higher levels of radon in your home. Radon's, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't see it. The only way to know if you have radon or high levels of radon in your home is to have it tested. Radon tests, a lot of our home inspectors are certified to perform radon tests. But what they do is they set up these little contractions in the home. And every hour it takes like a snapshot of the radon level. So this is the radon level at noon. This is the radon level at 1. This is the radon level at 2. You guys with me? Every hour. And after 2 or 3 days, they go back, they pull this contraction and they generate a report. They get an average of the radon level. And if the average is 4.0 picocuries or more, the radon level is considered undesirable. How we can treat, ventilation does a good job, open those windows and doors, but probably the preferred method for treating high levels of radon is a radon mitigation system. And that's what you're looking at right here in this house. You see this pipe that's up the side of the house here, and it's drilled into the crawl space down here. And then there's these little fans in this pipe. So it's pulling the air from the crawl space. It's preventing it from going into the home. And these little fans are pulling the air and sending the air up into the atmosphere where the radon gas belongs. Not trapped, not compartmentalized in your home. Again, radon affects the air that we breathe. So we could be getting into some respiratory issues. Some lung cancer possibly. Radon's tricky. You may have one neighbor test for radon and they test 2.0 picocuries. And then the guy next door tests for radon and they come in at 8. There is no rhyme or reason to where radon goes. It's going to go wherever it wants to go. If you have a mitigation system, or if you're working with a buyer that has a mitigation system, they're interested in a home with a mitigation system, you may still want to consider having it tested. You may still want to have a conversation with your buyer about having it tested, because these little fans that pull the air don't last forever. They may have a lifetime warranty, but they don't last forever. I was showing a house once to buyers and there was a radon mitigation system in the basement. We pointed at it. We had a conversation about it. My buyer said, what the heck, let's have it tested. We had it tested and it came back at like 6 or 7 point something. I don't remember the exact number, but it was more than 4.0. I called the listing agent. The listing agent called the seller called their radon guy. Radon guy came out and guess what? Sure enough, those little fans have stopped working. So even though we had the system, if those fans aren't working, they're not doing it any good. Mitigation guy replaced the fans, had it retested, and poof, we were back down to under 4.0. My point is if you are a homeowner and you have one of these systems, it doesn't last forever. I think it's still worth having a conversation with the buyer and telling them that they have the option to have it tested as well. I think another thing worth mentioning when it comes to radon, you may have higher levels of radon in vacant homes. Homes are meant to breathe. They're meant to have windows open and closed, doors open and closed, AC units and heaters kick on and off, right? If you have a vacant unit, you may not have much airflow. So it might be if you test a vacant unit, it might be that radon levels are higher than if you did when it was occupied. Does that make sense? So if your buyer's buying a vacant home and it comes in really high, maybe they want a mitigation system. Maybe they want to wait until they move in and start opening doors and windows, depending on how high it is. New construction, man, some builders in new construction are actually starting to build with radon mitigation systems already. Because what do we know about today's construction? Our today's construction is designed so tightly sealed, we have no air flowing anywhere. And while that tightly sealed construction is good for our power bills, it may not allow that ventilation. So some builders, more higher end homes, some builders are just putting in these things when they build. Radon mitigation systems used commonly? Yeah, I mean, radon's everywhere. As a matter of fact, this is a map. You can see that our west is darker. They tend to have higher levels of radon, but it doesn't go way down east, does it? You still have pockets with lower levels of radon down east. Think about the ground in the mountains versus the beach, right? The mountains are more rocky, the beach is more sandy. It might absorb the radon a little bit better. But either way, you guys, it doesn't matter where you are. Even if your neighbor just had it tested yesterday, that means absolutely nothing for your radon level. And for some reason, to answer your question, I don't know why, but a lot of home inspectors will tell you that Winston-Salem is just known for having higher levels. I've always heard you can go get a home radon test, run out to Lowe's or Home Depot. I can't tell you the accuracy of them or anything like that. Some of you are looking very scared right now, and that concerns me. So go to Lowe's, get you a home test, and see what you're working with. If you really, really want to know, go to Google, find you a radon guy, and they can let you know for sure. But absolutely, we want to encourage our buyers to have it inspected so they know. When it comes to radon, our role, we've got to disclose any known presence of radon 4.0 picocuries or higher. Again, this is a material fact. 4.0 picocuries or higher is a material fact. And we've got to disclose that once we know. Understanding we're getting more into material facts in Unit 7, so please bear with me. The mere presence of a radon mitigation system is not a material fact. However, if you see a radon mitigation system, your little red flag should go up. And that little red flag should tell you to ask some questions. Why is it here? Did you have a high level that you're trying to treat it? If you're working with a buyer, encourage them to have inspections, even though there's a mitigation system in place for their own peace of mind. They may still want to consider having it tested.
Hi, Julie.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. Okay, so I want to make sure I understand. The mitigation system is that pipe that you showed on that home?
It's
Because I see them on a lot of
remediated.
houses.
Yep.
I thought it was to drain the water from.
Those are your gutters. That's do something else, don't they? Yep.
Okay.
And they may all look a little different, right? I mean, that's just one example. That's just one example. Again, those are the kinds of things when we see them, that's what we mean by your little red flag. You see a radon system, you're not going to get excited. Don't you buy this house? Little red flag goes up that says, hey, this is something you may want to consider investigating further. You guys with me? Little red flags. Pointing us, alerting us, letting us know that we may want to consider investigating further, ask questions, learn more about it. So let's go ahead and take our break. We're going to take 10. When we come back, we're going to keep talking about our environmental issues. And we're back. Okay. So cameras are coming on. So I'm going to take attendance. And before we jump back into Unit 20, I just want to take a minute. We had briefly mentioned that lead-based paint, and I have taken attendance. So if you just turn your camera on, please let me know in a private chat so I can count you present for this hour. We talked about the lead-based paint hazard addendum. I just want to show you guys real quick that we have any and all the forms that we're going to talk about in this class available to you. Some are, can you please ask me at the next break or after class? I won't remember between now and then, Alyssa. So some of the forms we're going to go into in great detail, and I have those for you guys. But some of the forms we're not going to go into, but we still want to make them available to you. So if you guys get in the online learning system, first off, is everybody in the online learning system? Good. Good. Okay. If you're not, please do. Please get in it. There's some really good stuff in here. But in the online learning system, under the welcome section here on the left, we have a form for the 2022 forms. This is the current forms. They just updated the forms in July of last year. So when we click on this link, we say it takes us to, I mean, there's a ton of forms. We're not even going to discuss half of these, if that. But again, they're all available if you want to peruse them. So if you come in here and let's say you want to see the lead-based paint hazard addendum, then you can just start typing lead in the search and the form's going to come up. Again, you're not going to have a test question specifically about this form, but I know some of you are curious about it. I know some of you may want to see it. So we make it available here for you. Again, you can find this and any other form we may mention in that forms link. Okay. We'll get you more into forms when you get into post licensing. Obviously more into forms once you start working with buyers and sellers. So we'll introduce you to the forms slowly, gradually. Have you guys heard yet this is an industry of forms? Well, you have now for the first time, because you know what we like? There's an old saying, there's a form for that. So if it happens, there's a really good possibility we got a form for that. Again, we'll talk more about our forms, our contracts as we go. So back into Unit 20. This was radon and the commission's stance on that. Another scary environmental concern that we have is formaldehyde. Formaldehyde can be found in a couple of different places. It can be found in pressed wood products, so think like particle board, plywood. It can also be used as an insulation. It's often commonly found in glues, like glues that hold furnitures together. If I have any High Point people, we know twice a year, we have the pleasure of having the High Point Furniture Market come to town. All that furniture, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of formaldehyde that comes to town with it. I had a pre-licensing student a couple classes ago said she bought a bed, and that bed came with a big red warning on it that said, this product may contain formaldehyde. Here's the deal with formaldehyde. They had banned it at some time, but since then that ban has been reduced to a warning, because the jury's still out on the possible health complications, health consequences. So today, formaldehyde just comes with a warning. Another thing that could affect respiratory, among other things. Another scary thing we have, and this one scares me, carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide poisoning is no joke. Carbon monoxide, first off, is a result of incomplete fuel combustion. So you have a connector and it's not connecting and it's emitting these gases. The gases it's emitting is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is often referred to as the silent killer. You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't taste it. Here's the deal with carbon monoxide poisoning. People could go to bed at night and never wake up if they suffer carbon monoxide poisoning. You just go to sleep and you don't wake up. You guys remember that hotel in Boone about 10 years ago, 12 years ago? Y'all, they lost 2 families. Come to find out it was carbon monoxide. The first family, they said, ooh, that's weird. The second family, they were like, huh, investigated, and it traced it back to carbon monoxide poisoning. There are carbon monoxide detectors that will alert you if there's carbon monoxide in your home. If you do not have a carbon monoxide detector, please make yourself a shopping list and run out and get one. You guys promise me that? Sometimes you can even find like the dual things now, smoke detector / carbon monoxide detector. Again, ventilation can help, but you still need to be alerted the fact if there is carbon monoxide in your home.
Is this something we tell our buyers to test for? I mean,
If
like
they-
formaldehyde, is there a test for it?
I mean, there's nothing they can do with formaldehyde. Again, just kind of give them that warning. I don't know of a test. You know, carbon monoxide, we may want to look at the buyers and say, well, there's not a detector in this home, so you may want to consider having one put in. Will one do per home? I don't, you know, Tiffany, I'm going to let you look at the package because they might tell you on the package that this is good for a level, for example, or so many square feet, right? So, because all these detectors are a little bit different. So I'll let you look at the package and see. Again, you guys, we're just trying to help educate the public. Another scary thing we have, not as scary, electromagnetic fields. This is electrical currents that are generated by our power plants, our power lines. This is one of these things, again, the jury's still out if there's any major health complications or not. It's been my experience. Some people don't mind living near an electromagnetic field or a high tension power line. Some people mind, some people don't. Comes down to personal preference. If there's concern, to answer Tom's question, if there's concern, if your buyer has questions, we can always encourage them to call the power company. The power company can come out and do an EMF test. EMF, electromagnetic field. Have you guys ever stood close to one of these things? They're kind of weird. You can hear them. You feel a little hair stand up. I had buyers, I showed you guys know when you're driving down the road and you see these things like in a line and they go as far as the eye could see. I had buyers that were interested in a home right next to one of these things. And I said, it's next to a high tension power line. Does this bother you? And they said, we don't know. We pulled in the driveway and they got out of the car and they were like, nope. We got back in the car and left. So did it bother them? As it come to find out, it did. Just that. So again, it comes down to personal preference. The jury's still out on any health complications, health implications. Another scary thing we have is when our groundwater gets contaminated. When anything at the Earth's surface or our groundwater is contaminated, that groundwater flows into what eventually becomes our drinking water. So it could affect our drinking water supply. Sources from groundwater contaminations, maybe there was a surface spill. Maybe there's an underground storage tank, which we're talking about next. Maybe there's a leaking on-site septic system. Anything that leaks, contaminates our groundwater. So when you guys are carbon monoxide detecting shopping, carbon monoxide detector shopping, why don't you pick you up a couple gallons of emergency water, just in case. Have that on hand. My High Point people, we had remember our E. coli scare a couple years ago? You know what I learned from that? Go get some water. Y'all got your shopping list going? Carbon monoxide detector, emergency water. As mentioned, up next, we have underground storage tanks, also known as UST. So underground storage tanks are made of steel. The problem is they in time corrode. And when they corrode, the contents leak out, contaminate the ground. Some things you may find in underground storage tank: oils, gases, things meant to help heat the home, for example. So with underground storage tanks, there's a couple different things to consider. First off, if one is still in use, you'll be able to know when you're walking in the backyard, if you trip over a pipe sticking out of the yard, that pipe is attached to something. And more than likely, it's going to be attached to an underground storage tank. So if you're walking in the backyard with a buyer or seller and you trip and you fall, on your way down, your little red flag should go up, alerting you to ask questions. What is this pipe I just tripped over? Here's the other thing to consider. We made a mistake in our history. In our past, once upon a time ago, when we had storage tanks that were no longer in use, we used to have the mentality or the philosophy of just bury them. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Poof, just like that is taken care of. As I mentioned, the problem is when those tanks corrode and the contents in the tanks start leaking. Guys, it is estimated, and this is just an estimate, there's no way to know for sure, but it's estimated that there are millions of abandoned underground storage tanks across the country. Millions with an M. That's a lot of unknown, undetected underground storage tanks. If the contents of the storage tank leaks, and it leaks onto the owner's property, onto the next, onto the next, onto the next. Once the leak is detected,
Julie, are you froze or you just standing there? Can y'all see me? Is Julie froze, y'all? Or she just, okay.
Yeah, she's frozen. Cause I thought it was my connection.
I thought it was mine too.
I think she's around Winston-Salem, Greensboro area. Are you guys having storms out there?
All good here, Tom.
I'm not having any storm here.
You guys there? Did you miss me? Hi. I don't know what happened, but we're back.
We missed you.
Well, thank you. Did y'all take time and go over words and vocabulary terms together? Shake your head yes. Sure. Look at you guys. Oh yeah, that's exactly what we did. Yeah, I don't know what happened. You know, the internet's great when it works, right? Technology is great when it works. Oh no, somebody just left. We're back. We're back. Okay. Everything's loading back up. Bear with me. So underground storage tanks.
I just heard that they were pretty common in the East Coast.
Everywhere. Absolutely. Carrie, the underground storage tanks. Yep. Like I said, the estimate is that there's millions buried, unknown, all over. Again, we thought, did you guys hear that part? We thought that was the solution. Just bury them out of sight, out of mind, not a problem anymore, right? Done deal. Guess what? It didn't work that way. So as I was saying, I think the last thing you guys heard was if there's a leak from an underground storage tank, they're going to trace it back to the source. And wherever the source is, wherever it starts, the owner of the property is the one that's liable for cleanup. Now, don't get too excited on me. There's funds out there. There are programs out there to help them with this cleanup. They're not on it on their own. But the owner is responsible. Wherever it's located, the property. With underground storage tanks, there's lots of regulations. There's federal and state regulations on detention, cleanup, removal. Let the experts handle it. Don't think you're going to run out there with your funnel and your kitty litter and take care of it. It just doesn't work that way. Just make a note, we're not studying this, but there is something called, we talked about the funding that's available. It's something called the North Carolina Leaky Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. We will briefly mention that when we get to page 510. I want you guys to make a note. There's a fascinating example in your book on page 505. Please don't read it now because we're in the middle of class. But make yourself a note to read that example. I think that really shows what could happen with undetected underground storage tanks. Question comes in, is it a material fact? Again, if we know about it, then it's probably still in use. That's when the pipe's sticking up from the ground, right? So we got to disclose where the heat source comes from. So if it's like oil in an underground storage tank, then we're going to disclose that for sure. So with these, the broker's responsibility for underground storage tanks. Again, once we know of a current underground storage tank, one that's currently in use, or if we happen to learn of one, that's a material fact that we have to disclose. And the buyers may want to consider having an expert inspect the tank. Soil contamination test will tell you if the soil is contaminated, if it's leaking. Again, all things for the buyer to consider. Another thing that could be an environmental concern is our landfills. Landfills are either dug specifically for the purpose of being a landfill, or maybe it was left over from a surface mining operation. But landfills are regulated. They have controlled drainage. So we don't want, for lack of a better term, garbage juice soaking into the ground, right? We want that to be disposed of to go somewhere. And that's part of the regulations that we have with our landfills, is that controlled damage or that controlled drainage. And as you can see, they're highly regulated. Federal, state, and local laws regulate the maintenance, the construction. If you have a buyer interested in a home that's near a landfill, point it out to them, let them know. How do you know? You go to Google Maps, you type in the address and you zoom out. This is what we're helping our buyer do, is learn that not just the property, but everything around the property. Again, some buyers have a concern with this, others don't. Have you ever been near a landfill on a hot August day? It doesn't smell too good, does it? Another thing we have, and probably one of the bigger things that we deal with, is mold. Mold's everywhere. There's different strains, there's different variants. Y'all take a big deep breath with me. Ready? You just breathed in a whole bunch of mold. Sorry. It is everywhere. There is no escaping it. Mold ranges. Mold could include that mold could be on that loaf of bread you've had a little too long. And it could range and vary the whole way to black toxic mold. All mold needs is a little bit of moisture and a little bit of oxygen. And it can grow rapidly. Have you guys ever walked down to a basement and thought, this smells basement-y? There is no official smell called basement-y. Probably what you're smelling is some kind of mold or mildew. It can affect respiratory, again, because we're breathing this air, with major mold spills, mold contaminations like this wall you're looking at here. Talking about those red flags. Whenever you learn of a possible leak or maybe a flood, a previous leak or flood, or a potential leak or flood, our little red flag should go up to alert us to ask some questions. If you're getting ready to list a property and the seller tells you they had a previous flood in the basement, ask questions. Did you have problems with mold? Did you get that taken care of? Again, you guys, we need the experts to come in. You're not going to be able to show up with your bleach spray bottle and take care of it. It just doesn't work that way. What we need to know as brokers when it comes to mold, the Real Estate Commission has weighed in. They've said the mere presence of mold isn't a material fact because it's everywhere. Mold is not a material fact unless it's in excessive amount. And they say an excessive amount is more than 1 square foot. I'm going to say if you can see it or smell it, it's excessive. Our little red flag should go up. And the other thing that's causing, as we mentioned, our little red flag to go up is looking for signs. Again, if there was a previous leak or a previous flood on the property, maybe the bathroom upstairs flooded, maybe the basement floods. We need to be able to identify those signs so we can encourage our parties to investigate further, learn more about it. So we mentioned earlier, there's acts in place to help property owners clean up or remediate some of these environmental concerns. Particularly on page 509, you have something called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, probably better known as CERCLA. It provides fundings to help clean up some of these various environmental concerns. The owner of the property is the one that's going to be responsible for cleanup. But keep in mind, there's funds available. Please look over with me, page 510, 511. Just mention some North Carolina environmental issues and some state acts that we have to help, again, with some of these environmental concerns. There's our Leaky Petroleum Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act. We got Coastal Area Management Act, Mountain Ridge Protection Act, Dredge and Fill Act, and Sediment Pollution Control Act. Again, please don't spend all your study time on these, but know that there are state and federal acts available to help the owners, help them with cleanup. So with these environmental concerns, these environmental issues, again, the liability is on the owner. The owner is going to be the one responsible, the owner of the property where the environmental concern is. They're the ones that are going to have the greatest amount of liability. They're the ones that are going to have to deal with it. However, the real estate agent is not off the hook. We have a duty to disclose. Once we learn about an environmental concern, we have a duty to disclose. It's not necessarily my job to find these environmental hazards unless my little red flag goes up. Guys, I can't ignore these signs. If you smell something that smells moldy, guess what's probably nearby? Mold. Don't pretend like you didn't smell it. We got to be on the lookout for these signs. And once we learn of an environmental concern, then we've got to disclose it.
Question. So
Yep.
are termites involved with that too? Once we know we have to say it?
Termites are a material fact, yes. Yep. Man, those little buggers can do some damage, can't they? Again, disclose, 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 which is a great introduction to get us into Unit 7, because we're going to talk a lot more about material facts, disclosing. And that gets us through Unit 20. So there's those key terms. Do we see a lot of green stars in Unit 20? I did. I mean, we're going to look at it, but we're not going to spend all our study time on it. So there's those key terms. Key point review, the summary, the checklist is on page 512. And then you have a nice little quiz for Unit 20 on page 515. Questions on our environmental concerns, our environmental issues.
You said several times it is the owner's responsibility, and I don't disagree with that. But at the bottom of 509, it talks about retroactivity or retroactive responsibility. So,
Maybe CERCLA does decide to make it retro. I mean, that would kind of be up to them. That would kind of be hard to do though, right? To prove where it started, what owner did it start with? But maybe if they can find that the previous owner was in default, then maybe they will require them to partake in the cleanup. But I think generally speaking, the current owner is going to be the one that's responsible.
yeah.
So I also have a question about the when we were talking about the mold being in people's houses. So my uncle, his house, he has mold in his house and he's renting from a lady and he's told her about the mold multiple times and she won't like it's on the landlord to like fix it, right?
The landlord is to provide fit and habitable conditions. So what I would do is tell your, I'm sorry, you said your
It's my uncle.
uncle, I would tell your uncle to look at the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. And
Okay.
that'll tell him the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. You and I are going to talk about that when we get to Unit 11.
Okay.
But in the meantime, until we get there, North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, and that's going to tell him his rights, what rights he may have.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Good stuff, huh? All right. Y'all want a Kahoot? We want to play our game? Yay, look at everybody perk up. Now hang on, let me make sure Kahoot didn't kick me out. Nope, looks like I'm still in. Maybe, we'll see. Yep, we're still in. All right, so you're getting your phones. If you don't, I know they're close by, because let's face it, these things are usually tethered to us. So you want to scan the QR code. If you're going the route of the app or the website, you need a code. That code for this game is 482-2474. No matter what route you go, they're going to ask you for your name. I'm fine if you want to use nicknames. Just please keep it clean. This Kahoot is on units 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. And as you're coming on, don't let your phone go to sleep. If your phone goes to sleep, it'll look like it's kicking you out. So keep your phone awake. Give you just a few more seconds if you want to play. Obviously, you don't have to play if you don't want to. I don't know why you wouldn't. It's a lot of fun. And hopefully it's helpful as well. Twofold. Good times, and it helps you gauge where you are. If you don't want to play on your phone, just please play in your mind, play along in your mind. Everybody in that wants to play? We ready? This is 4, 5, and 6. Question number 1. The system of legal description that defines a parcel of land by its parameter is five seconds. Legal description that defines it by the parameters, the meets and bounds. Remember, that's the one that we use, the point of beginning. We use the point of beginning for our starting point and our ending point. We take a tour of the property. We start here and we walk from here to here to here to here, knowing to turn at monuments, making our way back to the point of beginning to identify the parameters, to identify the property lines. Lot and block system is another way to refer to as our recorded plat map. And then the rectangular survey system is what they use out west with a grid. They put the grid system down. Questions on this one? Did I hear a question? Let's see who got it right the fastest. Out the gate, we got Ashley. followed by DA, Jasmine, Renetta, and April. Question number 2. North Carolina real estate transaction. Excise taxes are the responsibility of the Five seconds. Who pays excise taxes? The seller. It was kind of a 50-50 shot here, wasn't it? Remember, you pay taxes when you buy the property, you pay taxes while you own the property, and guess what? They're going to get you one more time when you sell the property. That one more time is excise taxes, and sellers are responsible for paying that. Very few of you ever say the agent, and I love it, because y'all are like, I don't know what this is, but I ain't paying for it. I hear you loud and clear. So we're going to put it off on somebody, right? Seller, buyer. In this case, excise taxes are paid by the seller. End of unit 5. Questions on this one? So Ashley and DA switched up. DA's on top now. Tiff climbed up. CGB's up. Mari's up. OS is our highest climber. They are up 7 places. You might see a little icon, whoever OS is. You might see a little icon on your phone telling you you're the highest climber. Number 3, which of the following deeds contains no express or implied warranties? No warranties. Y'all finished that one fast. So which of the following contains no express or implied warranties? The quitclaim deed. There are no warranties with the quitclaim deed. The quitclaim deed says what I got, you get. So if I got nothing, what you gonna get? Absolutely nothing. We use a quitclaim deed when we're using it to correct an error. Maybe when you have somebody that purchased property and then gets married and they want to convey it from me to us, we would use a quitclaim deed. May also use a quitclaim deed in the case of a divorce, convey the property from us to me. General warranty deed has the most warranties. It is the one that offers the most warranties, the most covenants from the grantor to the grantee. Special warranty deed has 2 warranties. Questions on this one? So now we got DA staying up top. OS came up, Nicole came up, Caitlin came up, Sean came up. Tom is our highest climber this round. He's up 7 places. Question number 4, which of the following is an essential element of a valid deed? Ten seconds. You guys are fast. Okay, let's all turn to our book and look at page 87. Let's all turn and look at page 87. Hold your place. We'll go back. When we talked about a deed, we have essential elements of a valid deed. And what we're referring to are these essential elements. In other words, when the judge is looking at the deed and the judge is trying to determine the validity, the essential elements on page 87 is what the judge is looking for. The judge is the one that gets to determine the validity of a document. Remember, we talked about a required cake ingredients. So of these that we're looking at, the one that is essential, the one that the judge is looking for, those words of conveyance. They're looking for some kind of statement, something along the lines of, I, the grantor, give you, the grantee, my property. I, the grantor, am conveying my property to you. The deed needs to specifically state that. Now, let's look at page 88. 88 are other elements that we could see, but the judge isn't looking for them when they're trying to determine the validity of a deed. Page 88 is the icing and the sprinkles on top. It's not required to bake a cake. You guys with me? So when you see the word valid, I need you to think like a judge. What is the judge looking for? Again, in this case, the judge does not care if it's recorded. On page 88, we learn that it's something called the Connor Act that requires it to be recorded. The judge could determine the deed valid, even if it's not recorded. It's the Connor Act that calls it, that says it needs to be recorded. I strongly recommend you take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle and do a side-by-side comparison. These are the essential elements for a valid deed. These are the added ingredients. These are the things that enhance and make it better, but the judge is not looking for it. Questions on this one?
Me. Hi, Julie, it's me. Okay, I want to make sure I have this correct. So it's not an essential element to make it valid just for North Carolina, but for third parties, it has to be recorded.
Because the Connor Act says, not because
Right.
we're trying to determine the validity of it. You got it, Tiffany. Yep.
Okay, for third parties.
Again, we got to see a side-by-side of page 87 and 88. You guys see this? Because if you're asked for a valid deed, you're thinking through the eyes of the judge. If it's asking about recording the deed, now we're talking about the Connor Act. Piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, 87 on one side, 88 on the other, so we can see the valid deed or not. Other questions? So let's see what that did. That might have shook things up a bit. Nicole, claim up top. Sean, claim up. DA's on. Mari, OS is still on. Tom is still our highest climber this round, 2 rounds in a row. Question number 5, restrictive covenants. Five seconds. Apply to and bind all successive owners of the property. That's another way of saying restrictive covenants are appurtenant. What does it mean if it's appurtenant? It means it runs with the land. The developer creates them when they're creating the subdivision. Once the developer leaves, the covenants stay. Questions on this one? It's a good Kahoot. Let's see. Nicole stayed on top. Mari came up. Sean, OS, and Tom's on the board. April is our highest climber this round. She's up 3 places. You should see a little sign on your phone. Question number 6, the primary intent of zoning ordinances. Seven seconds. Primary intent of zoning ordinances is to control how we use the land and the structures. Can we use this for residential, commercial? Zoning will tell us that. Are we limited on the structures we can put on the land? Is there a setback requirement? Zoning will tell us this. There is a zoning term that could protect residential neighbors from commercial encroachment. We talked about the buffer zone. And that is a possibility with zoning, but it's not the primary intent. Keep in mind too, with the blue one, what's wrong with this? Zoning is local in nature. There are no statewide zoning ordinances. So Winston-Salem regulates Winston-Salem zoning. Charlotte regulates Charlotte zoning. Questions on this one? See what happened. Ooh, Nicole's on top. She's on fire this round. Sean came up, OS and Tom. Mari's still on the board. This last one could shake things up a little bit, couldn't it? Question number 7, which of the following best describes a variance? Ten seconds. What best describes a variance? A variance is an exception. Show me. How many property owners can go and request a variance? How many can go and request a variance? Only one. With a variance, one property owner is requesting, basically they're requesting permission to break the rules. They're going to the zoning board and they're saying, because of your zoning ordinance, I cannot use my property. They've got to prove a hardship. And if their request is granted and they get the variance, they have an exception. They have received permission to break the rules.
Question.
Yeah.
So what is the difference between that and, is it the non-conforming use?
So non-conforming use, the use and the rule don't match. We talked about legal non-conforming use and illegal non-conforming use. And we're asking ourselves, which came first, the rule or the use? You're using it illegally. You didn't ask permission. With a variance, you're asking, one homeowner is asking permission to break the rules.
Okay, so if I had a convenience store, then they did some zoning, and if they're gonna allow me to keep having my convenience store, even though now it's residential, that's gonna be my non-conforming, right?
That would be a legal non-conforming use because the use was there before the rule. They're not going to make
Okay.
you shut down. Other questions on a variance? All right, let's see what we got here. The grand finale. Our third place winner is OS. Little penguin with a mask. Our second place winner is Sean. And our first place winner this round is Nicole. I got 4th and 5th runners up, Mari and Tom. Good job, everybody. I'll go buy yourselves a candy bar tomorrow. That's what we do when we Kahoot. You Kahoot, you get to buy a candy bar. So make sure you swing by Tiffany's convenience store and get a candy bar. Help her out, support local, right? Any questions on this Kahoot? Good job, you guys. Remember, we've blown through, tomorrow will be 2 weeks that we're together. We've blown through 7 units already, 1 through 6 and 20. Guess what? We're getting ready to slow down. We're probably going to spend the next 2 or 3 classes just on unit 7. Not saying that we're going to slow down, but saying there's so much material to cover in unit 7, we got to spend more time in it. Remember on the first day, we talked about some things are more heavily tested than others. Some of you may not feel like I spent enough time in unit 20. My time in each unit is gauged on how many test questions you can expect. So I could spend a whole lot more time in unit 20 and less time in unit 7, if that's what y'all want. But I'm trying to tell you, you're going to be tested more on unit 7 than what you are in unit 20. So part of what we've been doing so far is building ourselves up and getting ourselves ready for unit 7. Please make sure you're going back and reviewing 1 through 6 and 20 to keep that stuff fresh in your mind, because you are still going to see a few test questions, just not as many as what we're getting ready to see after break. Fair enough? I do things on purpose in this class. Okay. All right. Speaking of break, let's take 10. When we come back, we are jumping right into unit 7. Here we go.
Miss Julie,
Yeah.
before you go, I like to put mine in some, not, full paragraphs so I can remember. I just want to make sure I want to confirm this. Variance, law before use, and non-confirming use before law.
And you can go back and review.
Okay, I definitely will.
Yep.
Definitely
I don't
will.
know what's going on with my timer here. Let's see. You guys are going to get extra time on this break. There it goes. There we go. There you go. And we're back. I've had another request for the YouTube channel, so that is in the chat. Please copy and paste that into a browser, save it, bookmark it. Refer back to it. Again, there's no rearview mirror in this class, so we're putting 1 through 6 and 20 behind us so we can start focusing on Unit 7. So before we get to Unit 7, let's talk about a few things. And I'm going to minimize this so you're not blinded by the flashing light. Okay. As we get into Unit 7, we start getting into agency. Remember last week I told you guys Unit 7, 8, 9, and 10 were heavily tested units. So we're starting to get into lots of red stars, lots of good material. We've been building up to this. Did I take attendance? I don't think I did. I was so excited to get into Unit 7. So let me go ahead and take attendance. There we go. Okay. As we start getting into Unit 7 and 8, 9, and 10, we need to start introducing you guys to something, a couple different laws and rules that we have to follow. So we have North Carolina licensing law, and we also have real estate commission rule. And we're going to start introducing you guys to license law and commission rule. When we look in the online learning system in just a second, we're going to see we have a section, we have time in this class dedicated to license law and commission rule. As a matter of fact, the last thing we do together is license law and commission rule. And all that's a great candidate for your state exam because it's specific to North Carolina. So as I'm starting introducing you guys to this, I want to make sure you all know how you can access the license law and commission rule and where you can find it so you can refer back to it. Some I'm going to ask you to read. Others, I just want you to reference. I want you to know where you can find it. I will let you know what I want you to read or not. Has anybody ever sat down and ever tried to read law? Boring, right? So I understand you guys aren't going to sit down and devour this book. Let me help you point out the pieces that you need to know. Let me help direct you so you can start forming this thing that we're working on. So before I show you guys where to find license law and commission rule, I first want to tell you where not to look. Everybody hear me? When we talk about license law and commission rule, where you're not going to look, everybody please turn with me to page 569 in your book. Starting on page 569, you have Appendix A. Appendix A is license law and commission rule, but guess what? Your book is out of date. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you what has changed and what hasn't. So we're just all going to agree that when we're looking at license law and commission rule, we're not going to refer to Appendix A in your textbook. It drives me nuts that they put forms and this license law and commission rule in your book, because as soon as they print this thing, they're out of date and we have a whole bunch of wasted paper. So anytime we have a form, anytime we are talking about license law and commission rule, one of the first places we're going to look is our online learning system. So if we look here first, everybody see my screen? Okay. And on the left-hand side, you have the various units. And as I said, this is a whole section at the very end of this class. So the last thing that we do is license law and commission rule. And within here, I have the current North Carolina real estate license law and commission rules. This is one source for you. This is one place for you guys to find the information. License law is North Carolina general statute. Our governing bodies created license law. The Real Estate Commission has the power to make their own rules, and that's what's referred to as commission rule. So the two together are license law and commission rule. What I don't care for about this book, and why I want to give you another alternative, it breaks it up into two columns, and when you're trying to read it on your screen, it gets kind of hard. So what I want to do is introduce you guys to another way, another source that you guys can access this material that can also help you with your careers. So I want you all to write this website down, ncrec.gov. ncrec.gov. And if you ever forget, just Google North Carolina Real Estate Commission, and this is bound to come up. We are going to spend a little bit of time in the commission's website. I encourage you guys to kind of poke around, see what the different tabs are. Uh-oh, can you guys not hear me? Can you guys hear me? What's up with audio tonight? Let's try this again. Yep, of course. So log out and log back in. So we're going to introduce you guys to several things on the commission's website, but this is your first introduction. I think it's not bad for you guys to kind of poke around the various things that it has to offer. And again, there's more that we'll talk about. Since we're here on the commission's website on the home page, if we scroll down on the home page, one thing we see down here is our license, law, and commission rule. Everybody see this? And when I click on this, license, law, and rule, it takes me to these pages where I can find links to the law and a link to the rule. So for example, what I like about this much better than what you have in the online learning system, we're getting ready to talk a lot about the rules. Chapter 58A is the rules. And you can see, as soon as it loads, there we go. It gives you the different categories with the different numbers. And if we were to click on a random one, then, well, that was a bad one. But if we were to click on a random one with content, then it gives you in one page, not in like 2 columns. Can you hear me now? Okay. So it gives you like one page, not in 2 columns. So I think it's easier to access and look at the law and rule here than it is trying to do this 2-column thing. Again, some of these I'm going to ask you to sit down and read. When I do, I need you to know where to find it. Others, I'm just giving you the law and the rule for reference. Okay, so no Appendix A, either the online learning system or ncrec.gov. Questions on this? So that means now that we know some of our resources, we're going to get started on Unit 7 tonight. We're going to be here tomorrow. We'll probably be here. We'll be here Thursday. We may even be in Unit 7 into next week. There's a lot of information in Unit 7. Unit 7 is forming our brokerage relationships, talking about various laws and practices. Keep in mind as we go through Unit 7, the primary focus is residential sales. So as we talk about these brokerage relationships, the primary focus is working with buyers and sellers. We are going to mention property management. We're going to talk about working with owners as a landlord. We're going to talk about working with tenants. We'll get to those units. While we don't address it here, the brokerage relationships applies to residential sales and property management. This is the unit that tells us how we can work with the consumers, the various laws and practices that we can work with the consumers. So our roadmap for Unit 7, we're going to define agency. We're going to talk about the different types of agency relationships that we can have. We're going to talk about a customer and a client. And we're going to differentiate our roles that we owe each. The client and the customer don't get the same level of service from me. So we're going to explain what those roles for each are. There's that material fact. We're going to talk about things that are a material fact. We're going to talk about things that are not. We're going to talk about our duty to disclose. And then we're going to talk about my duty to disclose my agency status. The general public, the consumer, when they first meet me, they have a right to know who I represent in this transaction. They have a right to know where my loyalty is. And that's what we're going to do with our working with real estate agent disclosure. This is my opportunity to tell you where I stand in this transaction. So before we jump into unit 7, and just put your pencils down for a minute, we're just going to have a few conversations. I think if we can talk about a couple things up front, then you'll be better apt to wrap your brain around it as we go. I promise you, everything that we're getting ready to see, we will see later in the unit. So pencils down, and please for a second, just listen. Again, I promise you, I'll have a page number and I'll have a PowerPoint for you on it in just a minute. Okay? The first term that we're going to encounter that we need to understand, our Latin lesson for the day, is caveat emptor. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. North Carolina is a caveat emptor state, which means it is the buyer's responsibility to learn about the property. It is the buyer's responsibility to investigate and learn about the property before they buy. The seller doesn't have to disclose much. So we're going to talk about that caveat emptor. How does that look for the seller and the buyer's responsibility to learn about the property? In a real estate transaction, the consumer hires the firm, not the individual agent. So when the seller hires seller hires an agent, they're not hiring the individual, they're hiring the firm. Whatever firm you affiliate allows you to work with their seller. Your firm allows you to work with their buyer. The relationship is between the consumer and the firm. Now, we all run around, and you will too, talking about my agent or my buyer and my seller, but that's not accurate. It's the firm's buyer. It's the firm's seller. That's where our relationship starts. All homes in North Carolina are sold as is, which means the seller is not required to do any repairs. Shake your head, yes or no. Could they agree to do repairs? Could they agree to fix something? Absolutely. There's no rule that says the buyer can't ask. The seller is free to agree to do repairs, but there's no obligation. Homes are sold as is. This is something our buyers need to understand early. Y'all ready for this? I have some potentially mind-blowing information. You ready? Hang on to your seats. There is no such thing as a perfect home. What? All homes have problems. All homes have issues. Y'all, humans built these things. Humans make mistakes. Even brand new construction is going to have problems. When we get into future units, particularly unit 10, we're going to talk about how the buyer can respond to this caveat emptor and this as is thing, and how they can protect their interests. Again, we're getting there. In a typical transaction, this doesn't apply all the time, but in a typical transaction, the seller pays the commission to the listing firm. The listing firm shares their commission with whomever brought the buyer. Maybe the buyer came from an agent in a different firm. Maybe the buyer came from an agent within the same firm. We're going to talk about those relationships in Unit 7, working with agents in differing firms, competing firms, and working with agents within our firm, within the same. What we need to understand is that the commission is paid directly from the seller to the listing firm, part of the listing agreement, and the listing firm will share their commission with whomever brings a buyer. Did I hear a question?
Julie, it says you're not in the meeting when I try to send you a direct message.
I'm not here.
It says, when I try to send you a direct message, it says Julie Campbell is not in this meeting in the chat.
Well, that's really weird. So you may, if it's something private, then you may want to send me an email after class. I bet you it had something to do with my lockup issue earlier.
That's good.
Weird. I don't pretend like I know Zoom, by the way. I have no effort. Mm-mm. So if you want to send me a text or a email, Tom, if it's private. Indeed
It's not
private.
it's not that important. I just wasn't sending it to everybody.
Okay. I look forward to it. So the seller typically pays commission to the listing firm. The listing firm shares their commission with whomever brings a buyer. We're going to talk about your commission. We're going to talk about how you get paid, when you get paid, how much you get paid. We're going to talk all about your commission when we get to Unit 8. Please don't ask me about commission in Unit 7. Before you guys can get paid, you have to form the relationships. So we're going in order. Unit 7, we're forming and defining the relationship. And Unit 8, we will get you paid. So does everybody agree? We're not going to talk about commission in this unit. I will talk all about your commission, including we're all going to pick up the calculator and figure out your commission when we get to Unit 8. But first, we got to form that relationship. The first step of getting you paid. As agents, we are fact finders only. My job is to help them provide the facts, help them find the facts, look the facts up, whatever it is, so they can make an informed decision. My opinion does not matter. I'm not the one buying this house. My job is to help them gather the information that they need so they can determine that this is a good decision to buy or sell. I can't make anybody do anything. I can't force anybody to do anything. I'm a fact finder. Some verbiage that we're going to start to encounter. You guys, I mean, you may want to jot this down. We'll see this slide like 2 more times before it's over, I promise. Different verbiage when you're talking about different terminology, depending on who you're talking about. Those that work with the buyer are often referred to as the buyer's agent, the buyer's firm. When we get into Unit 8, we're going to introduce you more to the selling agent and the selling firm. They are the ones selling the property to the buyer. Those that work with the seller, seller's agent, seller's firm. The terminology that we're going to start seeing is the listing agent and the listing firm. The confusion in these terminologies is the ing and the er. And that's why I have it highlighted for you. The selling agent is selling it to the buyer. The seller's agent is working with the seller. Again, we're going to see this at least 2 more times, but it's starting to introduce you, starting to get you to understand that terminology that we're going to see in the forms that we use, our day-to-day practice. So we introduced you guys to license law and commission rule a few minutes ago. And I said, if there's a license law or commission rule that I think you should read, I'll point it out to you. I think every single one of you should read Commission Rule A.0104. And as a matter of fact, it's so important, I have pulled it out and I've put it in our Campbell folder in the online learning system. So you don't even have to go find it. It's in the Campbell folder in our online learning system. And if somebody can help me remember, I'll try to show it to you before we leave tonight.
Julie?
Yeah.
I have a question. It's about the previous slide.
Okay.
Sorry, were you trying to say that those are other names for the same terms? For example, buyer's agent is the same as selling agent? Yeah?
That's it.
Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, she's got it. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. So Commission Rule .A104 is all about our agency agreements and our disclosures. Again, this is a rule I think you should read. And I will show you. If I forget at 8:29, somebody please remind me. And if y'all forget, I'll start class with that tomorrow night. but I want to show you where it is that I have it. When you guys are reading A.0104, I want you to read it. When you're done, I want you to read it again. Once you've read it the second time, guess what? What the heck? Read it again. You got between now and the end of your test to read it 6 times. This is the rule that regulates our agency agreements and our disclosure. So with all that being said, we are ready to officially get into Unit 7, and we are starting on page 134. Unit 7 starts on 134. How we work with consumers, how we work with buyers and sellers is regulated by the law of agency. The law of agency is what governs how we represent other people. This is what's important to know about the law of agency. The law of agency is not one specific law. It's comprised of several different things. They come together all to create the law of agency. So where do we get the law of agency? Well, first up, we have what's known as the common law of agency. The common law of agency comes from the early days of England when people served a king. It all started with that idea of serving a king. Over time, we have built on the common law of agency through contract law, court rulings, court law has helped form the law of agency. And then, as we've mentioned, we got North Carolina real estate license law and the real estate commission rule. License law and commission rule, that's what we just showed you. Our reference point. So before we get into agency today, let's go back. Let's do a quick history lesson. Let's talk about what agency used to look like and how we got to where we are today. It used to be in real estate that buyers were never represented. The only people that had representation from a real estate agent were sellers. Does that sound a little funny? Now knowing what we know today. Let's put this in different terms. Has anybody ever been car shopping? And you go to a dealership lot and you walk on the lot and the car salesman kind of pops up out of nowhere, right? Like, hey folks, how you doing tonight? When that car dealership pops up out of nowhere, we know that that salesman represents the dealership of the lot that you're on, right? We know that they have their best interest. We know that they're trying to sell a car. You as the buyer of this car, do they have any loyalty to you? Do they care about you? All they want you to do is buy a car so they can make a sale, right? You're not represented as a buyer. So let's say you go on this car lot to buy a car and you don't find a car that you like. You look in the whole lot, you don't see a car that you like. What do? Tell me, unmute yourself. What do you do in that case if you don't find a car that you like?
Go to another dealership.
Yeah, we go on to the next lot, don't we? We keep going from lot to lot until we find the car we like. Guess what? That's what real estate used to look like. When you wanted to buy a house, you went to a real estate firm. They showed you what they had available. They showed you your inventory. If you didn't like it, you said, thank you very much. And you went to the next firm. The buyers were never represented. It was only the sellers that worked with the firms, only the sellers that had that representation. Until there was a massive lawsuit that went down. Your book talks about it on page 135, the Adena lawsuit. Please don't read it now. Wait till after class. In the Adena lawsuit, after closing, there was a buyer that found out after closing that they were not represented by the real estate firm. They thought they were. The firm's actions implied to them that they were, that gave them that indication. This person genuinely felt that this firm had her best interest in mind. And she filed a lawsuit. And we know sometimes how these lawsuits work, right? Once she filed the lawsuit, then like all these other people stood up and said, oh yeah, me too. I wasn't treated. I felt like I had their interest. I felt like I was being represented. And now you're telling me that we're not? So this huge lawsuit ensued, and the real estate firm ended up settling for $19.9 million. Ouch. Because of that lawsuit, it caused all states all over the country to revisit agency, to revisit how they handle agency. And particularly in North Carolina, in the mid-90s, we decided to start offering buyer's agency. Did you hear what I just said? In the mid-90s. That wasn't that long ago. Buyer's agency in this state, overall big picture, is not that old. Guys, here's the deal. There are some states out there that still don't have buyer's agency. There are still some states out there that work as like a car dealership. You go from firm to firm to firm. North Carolina, today we have buyer agency. And this got us to where we are today. So understanding, again, we introduced you guys to caveat emptor. We said caveat emptor means what? I can see your mouths move. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. The burden of discovery is on the buyer. Caveat emptor puts the responsibility of learning about the property, investigating the property, on the buyer. The seller doesn't have to disclose. And guess what? When the buyer hires a firm and the firm allows an agent from the firm to work with the buyer, the agent takes on that responsibility with the buyer. That is my biggest responsibility as a buyer's agent, is to help my buyer learn about the property, to decide if they want to purchase. Remember, we said earlier, they may possibly have an out. We will talk about that out when we get to Unit 10. But the onus, the burden of discovery is on the buyer. There's not much that the seller's required to disclose. As a matter of fact, about the only thing I can think of offhand is the lead-based paint. If the seller knows of lead-based paint, they got to disclose. Other than that, they don't have to disclose anything. Does the roof leak? They don't have to disclose. Is there major structural issues? The seller doesn't have to disclose. Is there termites? The seller doesn't have to disclose. Caveat emptor is for the seller. We as the real estate agent don't get to hide behind caveat emptor. So when we get in, definitely in tomorrow night, we're going to talk about the conflict between agents working with a seller that have a duty to disclose and the sellers that don't have to disclose under caveat emptor. Can you see that conflict just off the top of your head? Can you see the conflict and the discourse between the seller and the agent? So how do we combat that? How do we work around that? We're getting there. Right now, let's just understand caveat emptor. It is on the buyer to learn about the property. When the buyer hires an agent, we take on that responsibility with them. Here's a big fancy word for you. The word is fiduciary. Fiduciary is a relationship of trust. When we enter into agency relationships with our principal, which I'm going to define on the next slide. When we enter into these relationships with our principal, they need to know that I have their best interest in mind. They need to know that we have formed this fiduciary relationship, this relationship of trust. They deserve to know that when they hire the firm, that we represent them and their best interest. So over on page 137, we define some words. Agency is that fiduciary relationship between the firm and the principal. Agency is the idea that one party represents another. Agency is the idea that someone stands in place of another. We're going to learn. What you tell me, you might as well be talking directly to my client, because what you share with me, I have a duty to take to my client. More on that probably tomorrow. Principal and client are the same thing. They're two terms that are used interchangeably. The principal or the client is the person that hires the firm. They hire the firm by entering into an agency agreement. How do you hire me? We enter into an agency agreement. Once we enter into an agency agreement, the consumer becomes my client. The consumer becomes my principal. Talking more about that in just a second. The agent is generally the individual that's authorized to represent the interest. Like I said, seller hires the firm allows one of you to work with their seller. Buyer hires the firm allows one of you to work with their buyer. They allow you to be the agent, to be the one that represents their principal. The subagent is an agent of an agent. Remember, we just said the client hires the firm. Let's pretend for just a second that all of you got your license and you're going to come work for me at Julie's Real Estate Shop. And one of you gets a listing. I allow you to work with my seller. The rest of you by default are subagents. We all owe those principals and those clients duties because that person hired me. And since you're all under my umbrella, we all fall under subagency. We all owe these principals and clients duties and responsibilities. Only one of you is working with them, but all of us owe that duty. We fall under that umbrella. The customer is the third party that didn't hire you. We can take all consumers in your market and we can put them in two categories. You're either my customer or my client. Everybody's my customer until you hire the firm. When you hire the firm, you become our client. Again, how do you hire the firm? We enter into an agency agreement. We're going to look at our agency agreements in Unit 8, just introducing you to the idea right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the difference in customer and client on the next few slides. The customer is the third party in the transaction. The customer is the one in the transaction that didn't hire the firm, your firm. And then the last definition we have here is a transactional broker, also known as a facilitator broker. In this transaction, nobody hired the agent. Everybody's unrepresented. Nobody is a client. Everybody's a customer. In North Carolina, this type of relationship is not allowed. In North Carolina, if the agent wants to be involved in the transaction, somebody had to hire the firm. Maybe it was a seller, maybe it was the buyer. Somebody has to be represented. You cannot have a non-agency relationship in North Carolina. Revisiting a lot of these terms, just introducing them to you. But right now, let's focus on this idea of client and customer. Again, take your entire market and put everybody in the market in two categories. Either you hire me or you don't. If you hire me, you get to be my client. If you don't hire me, you're my customer. And we're going to hear some words. We've already heard them. We're going to hear some more words about who's represented and who's unrepresented. The client is represented by your firm. The customer is unrepresented by your firm. Maybe the customer is represented by a different firm, but they're not represented by your firm. When it comes to agency, always stop and ask, who does my firm represent? Because that's where your loyalty is. That's who your client is. So the client is represented by your firm. The customer is not represented by your firm. They are unrepresented by your firm. So client versus customer. We work for our clients. We work with our customer. It's the difference in walking side by side with the customer versus hand in hand with the client. My client needs me to help them carry their bags. I got them. My client needs me to help them carry them. I got them. The customer doesn't get that offer. The customer doesn't get that level of service. We're going to start defining those levels of service, certain duties that we owe clients and customers tonight. We won't get through it, but we're going to start introducing you to, there's different services that I owe my client that my customer doesn't get. So I have this picture of an airplane. My mentor teaches, or used to teach. She actually used to teach nationally. So I gained a whole lot from her. And when she talks about agency, she uses this image of an airplane. And she knows I use it, by the way. When she talks about agency, she says, let's put the consumers in this transaction in a plane, and you, the agent, are the pilot. We're going to put our clients in first class. They're going to get first class treatment, first class service. We're going to put our customers back in coach. You as the pilot, aren't we all going from point A to point B at the same time? Aren't we driving this plane to make sure everybody gets safely to our destination, following all the rules and the laws at the same time? Yeah, you're the one flying this plane. That's your job, is to get it to point B, get it to closing. The difference is the level of service received in between. I hear first class is really nice. I hear you get what? Some champagne, maybe a warm meal, a hot towel. That sounds nice. You don't get that in coach, but back there with me, do you? What do we get in coach? Get like a lukewarm Coca-Cola and unsalted pretzels. We're still in the same plane. We're still going to the same destination. Again, you guys, the difference is the level of service that we receive in between. You become my client because you hire the firm. You do not hire the individual agent. So let's continuing to break this down. If you represent the seller, why don't you guys tell me in a chat, is this seller? Well, no, because the answer is right there. If you represent the seller, that means that the seller has hired the firm. The buyer is your customer. They're the unrepresented party in the transaction, which means my seller is the client, my buyer is the customer. Again, breaking down client and customer in the next couple slides. If you were the consumer, represent the buyer in this transaction. That means our loyalty. That means that what we owe is to the buyer. The buyer is our client, buyer's our client. The seller is our customer in this transaction. If you want to know who's your client, if you want to know who you represent, you always have to look up towards the firm, because that is the big picture. That is the umbrella that we are under, is the firm. So you could represent the seller with a buyer as your customer. You could represent the buyer with the seller as your customer. We're going to talk later in this unit that we may have a situation where your firm represents both buyer and seller. Both buyer and seller are sitting in first class. You don't have anybody back in coach. Both buyer and seller are your client. That's something called dual agency. We will talk about it. The other scenario we gave a few minutes ago is with that transactional broker. If you represent neither party, nobody has hired anybody. Both are your customer. And again, that's not allowed in North Carolina. That's that transactional broker. The transactional broker thing comes up a lot. Guys, here's the deal. Consumers don't know the parameters of my job. The consumer doesn't know what I am and am not allowed to do. That's my job to know my job. Does that make sense? So you may have somebody call you. You may have two friends call you. One wants to buy another friend's house. And those buddies may call you and say, we really don't want to hire you, but we need your help through the transaction. Shake your head, yes or no. Are you allowed to help them if neither one of them hire you? No, that is the relationship not allowed. You tell your friends, if you want me involved, if you want my help, somebody's got to hire me. That's a transaction where buyers and sellers don't need to know that. We need to know that. And I'm telling you, that comes up.
But
Question?
wouldn't it just be the customer if they don't hire you? Like, wouldn't
Right.
it
So
just be-
both buyer and seller are your customer in that situation.
So what about for sale by owner?
For sale by owner would be unrepresented. So in that case, you would have, you're representing the buyer and the seller is unrepresented. For sale by owner, they're choosing to go it alone. They're choosing to go unrepresented. You may have the buyer choose to go unrepresented. They don't have to hire. Guys, people buy and sell houses every day without the assistance of a real estate agent. There's no rule out there that says they have to use us for anything. If they choose to use us, this is our relationship. This is what we know. What else? So far.
What's the reality of really, if your firm is representing both sides, what is really fair? Because then both of you know the ins and outs of that home and what the person can afford and can't afford, et cetera, et cetera.
We're talking all about dual agency later in this unit. So hang on to all that, Carrie. We're getting to dual agency. Dual agency can get tricky just for the reasons that Carrie just said. Now I got two people in first class. Now I'm serving two kings. So how does that affect my duties and responsibilities? We'll get there for sure. What else? Okay.
So if they didn't need us or the real estate agent, is that like, do they just do that with a notarizer?
They
Or
get an attorney. Yep. They got to, they have more attorney's fees, right? Because they don't have access to our forms. That's a huge draw to use me, man. I got all the pre-printed forms. We'll look at those when we get to contract law. But now if we don't have me, now we have to have an attorney draft up the contract and things start costing more money. Did I hear another? I thought I heard somebody else just on mute just now. Okay. Again, just easing you in. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start talking about the duties. Let's see. Does every sale require a closing attorney? In North Carolina, it does. Other states may have different practices. We're going to go to closing and talk about that process more in Unit 21. So we've differentiated between the client and the customer, who gets first class treatment, who's back there and coach. And what we're going to do now, we're going to briefly introduce this to you, and then we'll really get into it tomorrow night. But I want to introduce you guys to the ideas of the duties that we owe our client. Those that are in first class, they get something called OLCAR. OLCAR, under the law of agency, helps us better understand these duties to our principal, duties to our client. Again, I'm not going to start on these tonight, so we know where we're going to pick up just on this slide tomorrow night. I'm going to show you that rule A104. See, my little mind works sometimes. But before we do that, I want everybody to understand something right now. One thing that OLCAR tells us, guys, this is not about you. This is about our client. This is about the person that hired us. This is not about you making lots and lots and lots of money. I'm telling you right now, if you're coming into this industry led by dollar signs, you may be in for a rude awakening. This is a people-driven industry. And I promise you, if you take care of the people, the money will follow. I promise you. If you take care of the people, so you have a transaction and you have your client, and you take really good care of your client, and you give them OLCAR, and you do everything for them that they're supposed to, and they're happy, at the end of the transaction, what are they doing? They're telling their family and friends that are telling their family and friends, and that's how you grow that business. Talk to an agent that's been at it for 30 years. They're not doing open houses anymore. They're not out there sludging the streets, handing out business cards, begging people to call them. Their business today is built off of previous businesses. If you do OLCAR right, you form those relationships that'll keep feeding you. Does this make sense? Can you make a lot of money in this industry? You better believe it. But it's not about you making money. It's about you giving OLCAR to your buyers and to your sellers. And again, I promise you, as sure as I stand here in front of you, the money will follow. I promise. So with that being said, this is where we're going to, don't go anywhere just yet. We're going to pick up here tomorrow night. We're going to talk about OLCAR, and then we're going to talk about the duties that we owe our customer. There's two different things to discuss. And then we'll get into this material fact thing. Real quick, in Learn, Test, Pass, the online learning system, our folders down here on the left. Remember Campbell, we have our very own folder. So right here is commission rule .A.0104. I got it right here for you guys. I don't know how I can make it any easier for you. Again, this is the commission rule that regulates agency agreements and disclosure. It's only like 2.5 pages, but it's still rules, so it's not an easy read. So break it up. Please don't commit to read it 6 times in one sitting. Break it up a little bit at a time. When you read it again, and oh yeah, read it again. A couple of you told me before class, I had my PowerPoints in here, but a few of you told me that the PDF wasn't valid, so I'm going to work on that tonight. If I can't get it fixed, I'll go to Jane in the morning. But bear with me, I'll try to get those PowerPoints to you. Hopefully we can get those Somebody had requested the YouTube channel link, so there it is again in the chat. I think that's all I have to say tonight. So y'all have a good night. We're gonna old car tomorrow night. We'll figure that out, what all that means. Sounds good? Sounds good. Y'all have a good night. Have a good day tomorrow.